the Wellington County Museum and Archives, and welcome to our episode of the County Cocktail Series. Today we're going to be visiting the beautiful township of Mapleton, and we'll be exploring some of the fascinating history of Prohibition, bootlegging, and the temperance groups from Mapleton in the 1900s. So come along with us as we go on our road trip, and let's get started. To our first destination on our road trip through Mapleton. We're here in Moorfield, and behind me is a very important building in Moorfield that is connected to the very fascinating history of Prohibition and temperance in Mapleton Township. Now historically, Maryborough and Peel townships, which now make up Mapleton, were very supportive of the temperance unions, and they were some of the first communities that bought into the local option in the 1870s. This was something that was set out in the Ontario Temperance Act, and it gave municipalities the option and power to ban the sale of alcohol in their communities. And Peel and Maryborough townships were some of the first communities in Wellington County to jump on this bandwagon and ban the sale of alcohol. Now, unfortunately though, this decision had a drastic effect on businesses, specifically for hotels in the area. This building behind me here was the Colliston Hotel originally. It opened up in 1872, and unfortunately for the Colliston Hotel, when the sale of alcohol was banned in Peel and Maryborough townships, they couldn't operate their barroom anymore, and so they were forced to close. Luckily, the Temperance Society in this area bought the hotel and ran it as a hotel that didn't have a liquor license. So they were running it as a hotel that didn't have a bar room, and this was so that there was still an option for travelers through this area. They still had an option of a place to stay if they needed to, and hopefully they would spend a little bit of money at some of the other businesses in this area. Prior to the local option and eventually Prohibition, hotels were the most common establishments for people to find their liquor. And this was a very lucrative area for the businesses themselves. Operating a tavern or a bar room in your hotel meant that you were bringing in a lot of profit for your business. But unfortunately, with Prohibition and the local option here in Mapleton, when the sale of alcohol was banned for the business, they suffered greatly. At the same time, in the 1920s, more people had access to cars and automobiles to travel around, and so finding customers to come and stay at these little small town hotels was a little bit more challenging for them. Since people could get to their destination more quickly, they might not have to stop at all of these small town hotels through Wellington County along their way. And then couple that with Prohibition and with not being able to operate their bar rooms, some of these small town hotels suffered greatly during the Prohibition era. Now, what happened to the Moorfield Temperance Hotel? Well, during Prohibition, the Ontario government had a system where they designated a number of hotels as what they called standard hotels. And these hotels in Ontario, they were permitted to sell light, non-intoxicating beer, which was anything that was below 2% alcohol. Guests were also allowed to have their own private supply of liquor in their private guest rooms. The standard hotels could also sell tobacco products, and interestingly, they could also operate an ice cream parlor at the hotel. And the Moorfield Temperance Hotel was one of the many hotels in Wellington County that was designated as one of these standard hotels. There were a number of standard hotels in Wellington County, all throughout this area, in Fergus, Elora, Guelph, all across Wellington County here, and this was just one of the ones that in this area were operating as standard hotels. So presumably, this hotel started selling the light beer that was under 2%, and maybe allowing a guest or two to have their own private bottle in their own private guest room here. Now, as for this building, it operated as a hotel until about 1927, despite the financial hardships that came with running the hotel without a liquor license. And then eventually it was sold in 1940 to become a chick hatchery, and then finally as an apartment building in the 1950s. So I think that just about wraps us up for this location here. Let's head on to our next stop on our Mapleton tour, and we'll see what happened when some of the hotels were a little bit more rebellious with the prohibition laws. We're here at our second location on our tour through Mapleton. We are in beautiful Drayton, Ontario, home to the Drayton Festival Theatre, and also home to some people who might have tried to skirt around the prohibition laws in the 1920s. In 1923, there was a constable named George Green who was out for a Tuesday evening stroll, and as he was walking down the street in Drayton, he saw a carriage pass by him, and this carriage was really suspicious because it didn't pull into a regular business. It went into the alleyway and in behind one of the hotels here in Drayton. And Constable Green, he was a very good detective, and so he thought, you know, something doesn't look quite right here. And so he walked into the hotel. The two men that were on the wagon had gone inside the hotel, and one of them was on the phone. The other was sitting in the hotel parlor. And so he goes over to the man who was sitting in the parlor, and he asks the man, "What do you have in that wagon?" And the man at that point said, "Oh, I don't know, it's the other guy, I have no idea what's in it." And so when the other man had gotten off the phone, Constable Green went over to that other man and asked him again, "What do you have in that wagon?" Now this man, to his mistake, had said, "I don't know, I'm refusing to answer." He didn't want to tell Constable Green at all what was in the wagon, which was a bad idea on his part because immediately the red flags started flying in Constable Green's mind. And so he goes out back and he pulls the tarps off of the wagon and he discovers bottles and bottles and bottles of whiskey. These two gentlemen had been trying to smuggle the whiskey into this hotel in Drayton and sell it to the hotel owner. And at that time, it was about $1,000 worth of whiskey that was on the back of this wagon, which today would be about $50,000 worth, which is just a huge amount of whiskey that we had discovered here that those smugglers were trying to get into the hotels in Drayton. So it turns out the man on the telephone was a man by the name of Henry Sealing. He was from St. Jacobs, so not too far away. And he was arrested and charged to pay $2,000 in fines, and he also had to spend 6 months in jail. Now it seems like a pretty harsh sentence for somebody, but Mr. Sealing, it turns out, had prior convictions smuggling alcohol and whiskey into other places. And so the judge had decided that he needed to have a harsher punishment because he showed very little repentance about his prior convictions and what he was doing. So Mr. Sealing spent those 6 months in prison. He had made the unfortunate assumption that a quiet little village like Drayton, he would have little chance of being discovered, but much to his dismay, Constable Green there was on the case and caught him. Now, as for the hotel in Drayton that was caught up in this scandal, the name of the hotel and the name of the owner were never released to the public, so we actually don't know who the hotel owner was or where the hotel was. That's forever lost to history. It's quite strange, though, that a hotel would purchase such a large amount of alcohol, specifically in this area where Peel and Maryborough townships were such big supporters of the temperance movements and eventually prohibition. It's possible that maybe they were helping to supply other hotels with liquor, or maybe acting as a wholesaler and spreading it around that way, but we're not quite sure, and so that is still a mystery to this day. The police never investigated any sort of illicit network that was happening here, so for us it's just sort of a mystery that lives on here in Drayton. Now, this brings us to the end of our tour through Mapleton, and I'm feeling quite thirsty, so let's head back to the museum and we'll make a Mapleton-inspired cocktail. We made it back to the museum, and I think we could use a little refreshment after our long journey up to Mapleton. So, to spite those pesky temperance unions, let's make a cocktail inspired by the history of Mapleton. For this cocktail, we are going to be making a maple orange spritzer. You might see a connection here with maple and Mapleton. And to make this cocktail, you can follow along at home. These are the things that you will need. You will need 3 ounces of orange juice, 2 ounces of sparkling water, 1 ounce of vodka. You'll also need a little dash of lime juice, 1 teaspoon of maple syrup, a couple wedges of limes, a couple sprigs of rosemary, and then finally some ice to make a very cool and refreshing drink. So now that you have your ingredients all gathered, let's start with making the drink here. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add our 1 ounce of vodka. So I'm going to pour it into my glass here. Just like so. We're going to add our dash of lime juice. Just a few squirts of lime juice in here. Add a little bit of flavor. And then we're going to add our 1 teaspoon of maple syrup. So I'm going to bring over my maple syrup, and I'm going to just very, very carefully measure out 1 teaspoon and add it into our drink. There we go. All right, next we're going to add our orange juice. So this is 3 ounces of orange juice that I'm going to pour into my glass here. We're also going to add our 2 ounces of sparkling water. Now we're going to give it a little bit of a stir to make sure that it's nice and mixed all the way through. It's looking very, very good so far. And then finally, let's top it off with a few ice cubes. And we'll garnish it with a lime wedge and a sprig of rosemary. All right, now let's give a little taste test to our cocktail here. Let's see. So good and perfect for a hot summer day. So thank you all so much for joining us for this episode of our County Cocktail Series. Make sure to come back next month when we travel to Wellington North and visit Silver Fox Distillery up in Arthur. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll see you next time.